What if the parts of yourself you spent the most energy trying to fix, the oversensitivity, the inability to say no, the exhaustion that never quite goes away, what if those weren't flaws at all? What if they were answers? Answers to questions you were never allowed to ask out loud. Adaptations that your mind and body built, quietly and without your permission, during the years when you had no other tools available. Years when surviving emotionally meant learning to be a certain kind of person, and then forgetting somewhere along the way that you had learned it at all. Many people move through their entire lives carrying patterns they don't understand, patterns that repeat across relationships, across jobs, across decades. The same emotional dynamics showing up in different clothes, the same fears, the same exhaustion, the same hollow feeling that persists even when life, by every external measure, looks perfectly fine. And the most disorienting part is this. These patterns don't feel like patterns, they feel like personality. They feel like the simple, unalterable truth of who you are. But according to the body of work developed by Dr. Gabor Maté, one of the most respected and influential voices in trauma-informed psychology, many of the traits we've come to think of as personality are in fact adaptations. They are the creative, intelligent, often deeply costly solutions that a child's developing mind constructed in response to an emotional environment that required them. Understanding that distinction between who you are and what you learn to become is not a small thing. For many people, it is the beginning of everything. Today, we are going to explore 9 psychological signs that tend to appear together in people who carry a particular kind of emotional depth and history. Not to diagnose you, not to define you, but to offer you something that is, in many ways, more valuable than any label. A framework for understanding yourself with more clarity, more compassion, and eventually more freedom. Let's begin. The first sign is perhaps the most common among people who carry this particular emotional profile. And it is common precisely because it is so easy to mistake for a virtue. You feel responsible for the emotional states of the people around you. Not occasionally, not situationally, but as the baseline mode of operating in the world, a constant, low-level monitoring of everyone else's inner weather, and an equally constant pull to do something about it when the forecast looks difficult. This is not the same as empathy, although it often lives alongside genuine empathy. Empathy is the capacity to feel with another person. What we are describing here is something more compulsive, a nervous system that learned, very early in life, that its own safety depended on the emotional comfort of the people nearby. Gabor Maté has explored this pattern extensively in the context of attachment theory, the study of the emotional bonds between children and their primary caregivers that form the psychological foundation for everything that follows. In a healthy attachment environment, a child learns something profound and simple. My needs matter. My emotions are welcome here. I do not have to earn closeness by managing how the people around me feel. But when that environment is disrupted, not necessarily through dramatic events, but through the quieter, more pervasive disruptions of parental stress, emotional unavailability, depression, addiction, unresolved trauma, or simply the emotional overwhelm of caregivers doing the best they can with too little, the child often learns a very different lesson. The lesson is survival level simple. The way to maintain connection is to make yourself useful to the emotional world of the people you depend on. The way to stay close is to stay attuned. And the way to keep love from going away is to make sure the people who hold it never become too uncomfortable. Imagine what this looks like in practice. It looks like the child who learns to read a parent's face before they've even entered the room, who adjusts their behavior, their tone, their very presence, based on the signal received in that first half second of contact, who becomes, without ever being taught, a specialist in the emotional management of the adults around them. And then imagine that child at 35, at 45, still reading rooms, still adjusting, still feeling, somewhere in the body, that familiar pull of responsibility whenever someone nearby seems unhappy, even when the unhappiness has nothing to do with them. From the outside, this person often looks extraordinarily caring, and in many ways they are. But beneath the care is something the outside rarely sees: the exhaustion, the resentment that builds slowly and is immediately suppressed, the profound difficulty of ever asking with genuine belief that the answer matters. What do I need right now? One recurring theme in Gabor Maté's work is the cost of living at a perpetual distance from one's own needs. And for people who develop this kind of emotional hypervigilance in childhood, that distance is not a choice. It is a groove worn so deep by early experience that it came to feel like the natural contour of the ground. Recognizing it is the first step towards something different. Not selfishness, not withdrawal, but the gradual, sometimes terrifying discovery that your own emotional life deserves exactly the quality of attention you have spent so long directing outward. The second sign grows directly from the roots of the first, but it expresses itself in a specific and often painful way. You find it extraordinarily difficult to say no. And when you do manage to say it, when you push through the discomfort and decline a request or set a limit, the guilt that follows can feel almost physically unbearable. This is one of the most widely recognized patterns in trauma-informed psychology, and it is also one of the most frequently misunderstood. From the outside, the inability to say no looks like agreeableness, generosity, flexibility. And on the surface, the person living with it often sincerely believes that is what it is. They tell themselves they simply enjoy helping. They tell themselves conflict is unpleasant and harmony is better. They find 100 reasonable sounding explanations for a pattern that is at its core driven not by choice, but by fear. From the perspective of Gabor Maté's work, the compulsive yes is almost always rooted in early experiences in which a child's authentic preferences, needs, or limits were treated as problems. Perhaps expressing disagreement reliably created tension. Perhaps saying I don't want to was met with withdrawal of warmth. Perhaps the child watched the parent become distressed whenever boundaries were asserted and learned through painful repetition that their own autonomy was a threat to the relationship they most depended on. The child's response to this discovery is not a character flaw. It is a rational adaptation. If my preferences put the relationship at risk, I will suppress my preferences. If my boundaries create pain for the people I need, I will dismantle my boundaries. I will become the person who always says yes, because yes keeps me connected, and connection, for a child, is not merely comforting. It is at the level of the nervous system a matter of survival. Fast forward to adulthood, the child is now someone who overcommits chronically, who agrees to things that cost them dearly, who lies awake running the mental arithmetic of everyone else's expectations, who feels at the moment of potential refusal not just social discomfort, but something older and more physical, a surge of anxiety that belongs not to the present moment, but to a moment decades earlier when saying no felt genuinely dangerous. Psychologists have noted that this pattern exists on a spectrum and can show up in many different life domains: at work, in friendships, in family relationships, in romantic partnerships. And one of its most consistent features is the resentment it generates. Because saying yes from compulsion is not the same as saying yes from generosity. It carries a silent ledger. And over time, that ledger becomes a source of real pain, both for the person maintaining it and often for the relationships it was meant to protect. This doesn't mean you are not genuinely generous. It means that your generosity may share space with something that was never a choice. And beginning to distinguish between the two is among the most clarifying and most difficult work a person can do. The third sign is quieter than the previous two, And it is harder to talk about because the people who carry it are so often told and so often tell themselves that they have no reason to feel the way they feel. There is a persistent sense of emptiness that doesn't respond to the things that should fill it. Not sadness exactly, not depression in the clinical textbook sense, though it can sometimes shade into that territory. Something more like a low, steady hollowness, a background hum of insufficiency that follows you into your accomplishments, your relationships, your moments of genuine pleasure, and quietly waits for them to pass. You may have built a life that, by every reasonable external measure, should feel meaningful. People who care about you, things you've achieved, moments of real beauty and connection, and yet something does not quite land. Something remains just beyond your capacity to feel it fully. And then comes the guilt, because you look at your life and you know intellectually that you're fortunate. And the emptiness you feel begins to feel like ingratitude, which adds shame to the hollowness, which makes the hollowness worse. From a trauma-informed perspective, and drawing specifically on the framework that Gabor Maté has developed over decades, this kind of persistent emotional numbness is almost never about ingratitude. It is almost never a failure of appreciation or a sign of fundamental emotional incapacity. In many cases, it is the direct and comprehensible consequence of emotional neglect, not the dramatic, recognizable kind, but the subtle, pervasive, often invisible kind. Emotional neglect is defined not by what was done, but by what was absent. It is the absence of attunement, the consistent, responsive, emotional presence of a caregiver who could see what the child was feeling and reflect it back with care and recognition. It is the absence of the message, communicated again and again through presence and attention, that your inner world matters, that what you feel is real and important and welcome. When that message is missing, when a child's emotional signals consistently go unmet, when their sadness is redirected, their excitement minimized, their fear dismissed, their anger punished, the child learns to do something that will cost them enormously in the years ahead. They learn to stop sending the signals. They disconnect, gradually and unconsciously, from their own inner life. They turn the volume down on their own emotional world. And the emptiness that so many adults describe, that persistent, inexplicable hollowness, is often the echo of that disconnection. It is not the absence of an inner life, it is the presence of an inner life that was never given permission to exist fully. And the extraordinary, hopeful thing about understanding it this way is what it implies. There is something there. It was never destroyed, it was suppressed. And suppression, unlike destruction, is reversible. The fourth sign follows naturally from the third, though it operates in almost the opposite direction. Where the third sign involves the kind of emotional numbness, a disconnection from one's own inner world, the fourth sign involves a kind of emotional overconnectivity with the inner worlds of others. You absorb other people's emotions, not as a figure of speech. Physically, you walk into a room and something shifts in your body. That corresponds to the emotional temperature of the people in it. You sit next to someone who's anxious and begin, without trying, to feel anxious yourself. You spend time with someone who's sad and carry that sadness home long after the conversation has ended. And in any given moment, you often cannot say with confidence which feelings are yours and which ones you've unconsciously taken on from someone nearby. This experience is real, it is recognizable, and it is a clear developmental origin that Gabor Maté's work helps illuminate. Children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments develop out of necessity an extraordinarily refined capacity to read emotional states. This is not a talent, it is a radar system, one the nervous system builds because it needs it. Because in an environment where a parent's mood can shift without warning, where the atmosphere of the home is never quite stable, knowing how someone feels before they show it becomes a genuine form of self-protection. The problem is that this capacity develops without a corresponding filter. The child learns to detect emotions with remarkable precision, but they don't learn to keep those emotions at a safe distance. They don't develop the internal boundary that would allow them to observe someone's pain without absorbing it, to be present with someone's fear without catching it in their own body. In adulthood, this shows up as a kind of permeability that can be genuinely exhausting. Social interactions drain in ways that are difficult to explain to people who don't experience them the same way. Crowds become overwhelming, not for reasons of noise or stimulation in the ordinary sense, but because of the sheer unfiltered volume of emotional input arriving simultaneously. And beneath the exhaustion is a deeper confusion, the difficulty of knowing at any given moment what you actually feel, of locating yourself within your own emotional experience when so much of that experience has been imported from the people around you. One of the quietest and most powerful questions a person with this pattern can learn to ask is simply, is this mine? Not as a deflection, not as a way of avoiding difficult feelings, but as a genuine, curious inquiry into the origin of what is happening inside. Because the capacity to ask that question, to pause and distinguish between what belongs to you and what you've unconsciously absorbed from someone else, is itself a form of boundary. And for many people who carry this pattern, it may be the first boundary they have ever been able to establish that feels truly internal. The fifth sign lives beneath a very convincing disguise, and the disguise is often success. You are driven by a deep and persistent belief that you are not enough, and no achievement, no praise, no evidence of your own capability seems to permanently close the gap. Gabor Maté draws a clear distinction in his work between what he describes as healthy striving, the kind that flows from genuine passion, curiosity, or a felt sense of purpose, and compulsive achievement, which flows not from fullness but from deficit, from the unconscious attempt to fill, through external validation, a wound that external validation cannot reach. This pattern traces, in most cases, to early experiences in which love or attention was primarily conditional, tied to performance rather than to presence. The child whose successes were celebrated and whose ordinary moments of need were overlooked. The child who learned through the accumulation of 1,000 small experiences rather than through any single dramatic event, that they were most visible, most valued, most lovable when they were producing something admirable. The message absorbed, not intellectually but at the level of felt experience, is stark. I am enough when I achieve. I am insufficient when I simply exist. That child becomes an adult who cannot rest, not because they lack discipline, but because rest feels genuinely dangerous. Rest means stopping the performance. And stopping the performance means confronting the possibility that without it, they are somehow exposed, somehow revealed as less than what they have been working so hard to appear to be. This is why the promotion doesn't satisfy, why the accomplishment feels hollow within days of its arrival, why the praise slides off without penetrating. Because the wound it is trying to address is not a wound of insufficient achievement. It is a wound of insufficient worth. And worth, genuine, unconditional, bone-level worth, cannot be earned. It can only be recognized. And recognizing it requires a very different kind of work than the kind this person has spent their life becoming expert at. If this resonates with you, it may help to simply notice, with curiosity, not judgment, the gap between how you speak to yourself about your own worth and how you would speak to someone you genuinely love about theirs. That gap is not evidence of a character flaw. It is evidence of a message you received before you had the capacity to question it. And messages, however deeply embedded, are not permanent facts. The sixth sign is one that touches on the most intimate territory in human experience. You crave deep connection, genuinely, powerfully, sometimes achingly, and you're also, often without fully realizing it, frightened of it. This is the paradox that attachment researchers describe as insecure attachment. And it creates one of the most exhausting and disorienting emotional experiences a person can live with: the simultaneous pull toward intimacy and the pull away from it, operating at the same time in the same nervous system with equal force. On one level, there's a longing so deep it is sometimes hard to look at directly, a longing to be known, not the curated version of yourself you present to the world, but all of it. The parts you're proud of and the parts you're ashamed of. The fears and the hopes and the confusion. To be that fully seen by another person and to have them stay. And on another level, running directly beneath that longing is a terror that closeness itself will confirm what the old wound already suspects, that being fully known leads inevitably to being found insufficient, to being left. One recurring theme in Gabor Mate's work is how early attachment experiences create internal templates, unconscious working models of what relationships are, what closeness means, and what can and cannot be trusted to remain. When those early experiences involve caregivers who were warm but inconsistent, available sometimes and absent others, loving in one moment and irritable or withdrawn in the next, the child's nervous system develops the deeply conflicted relationship with closeness itself. It learns to want love and to brace against it simultaneously, to approach and retreat in the same breath. And this pattern, unless it is recognized and gradually worked through, follows the person into every significant relationship they will ever have. In adulthood, it may look like relationships that begin with extraordinary intensity and then collapse under the weight of real intimacy. It may look like the impulse to withdraw precisely when a relationship becomes genuinely close. It may look like a pattern of choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable, not from self-destruction, but because emotional unavailability feels like familiar ground, like the territory the nervous system already knows how to navigate. Understanding this does not mean you're doomed to repeat the pattern. It means you can begin to see it. And what can be seen with honesty and patience, and often with skilled support, can change. The seventh sign is one that almost everyone who carries it has normalized completely because it has been present for so long that it has come to feel indistinguishable from truth. You live with a relentless inner critic, a voice that evaluates your every action, decision, and quality of being with a consistency and a harshness you would never, under any circumstances, direct toward another person. The double standard is remarkable. The person with a punishing inner critic is often the same person who extends extraordinary grace to everyone else around them, who forgives easily, who finds compassion readily for human struggle and imperfection in others, and who, turning the same attention toward themselves, finds nothing forgiving at all. From a trauma-informed perspective, the inner critic is rarely an original voice. It is an inherited one, absorbed from the emotional atmosphere of the early environment, and internalized so completely that over time it stopped sounding like something external and began sounding like the voice of reason itself. It may carry the tone of a parent who held high expectations, a caregiver who expressed disappointment readily, a family system where approval was conditional on performance. Or it may be less specific than that, simply the cumulative effect of an environment in which the child's ordinary human imperfection was treated as a problem to be corrected rather than a reality to be gently held. Gabor Maté has spoken and written about the concept of compassionate inquiry, the practice of turning toward our own inner experience with honest curiosity rather than with the judgment that so many of us have been conditioned by early experience to apply to ourselves. The inner critic does not respond well to being attacked. It tends to amplify when fought directly. But something interesting happens when it is met with genuine curiosity, when instead of arguing with it or surrendering to it, a person begins to ask where it came from, what it was originally trying to protect, and whether its methods are still serving the purpose they were designed for. That inquiry does not silence the inner critic immediately, but it begins, slowly, to create a different relationship with it, one in which the voice becomes less like an absolute authority and more like an old habit, one that can, with time and practice and compassion, be gently outgrown. The eighth sign is physical as much as emotional, and for many people, that has been one of the most confusing and isolating aspects of their experience. You are chronically tired. And the tiredness doesn't fully respond to rest, not the tiredness of a demanding week, not the fatigue that a good night's sleep repairs, something deeper, a weariness that persists in the background, regardless of how much you sleep, how carefully you rest, how many times you try to recover. A tiredness that sometimes makes you wonder if something is medically wrong, even when every test comes back normal. Gabor Maté has written extensively and compellingly about the relationship between emotional suppression, chronic stress, and physical health. One of the central insights that runs through his work is that the body does not remain neutral in the face of sustained psychological experience. What the mind learns to suppress, the body continues to carry. And what the body carries long enough, it begins to express in physical terms. When a person spends years, sometimes decades, maintaining emotional hypervigilance, suppressing feelings that aren't safe to express, performing a version of themselves that the environment seems to require, and never truly resting in the felt sense of being safe and allowed to exist without condition, the nervous system remains in a state of chronic low-grade activation. The stress response, which was designed to be temporary, a burst of mobilized energy in response to a genuine threat, becomes instead the permanent mode of operation. And the body, which was never designed to sustain this level of continuous activation, begins to show the cumulative cost in fatigue, in immune vulnerability, in disrupted sleep, in a bone-level weariness that no amount of conventional rest can fully address. Because what this kind of tiredness often requires is not more sleep. It is a different kind of permission. The permission to feel what is real. The permission to need what you need. The permission to stop performing, even briefly, and to simply exist, without the constant invisible labor of emotional management that has been operating in the background for so long, it has become invisible. That permission is not a small thing. For many people, it may be the most radical act of self-care they have ever attempted. Cornatus next